Hello everyone, welcome to this special edition of Eye on Africa on this Friday, September 9th, part of our continuing coverage of the death of Queen Elizabeth II. For the past 24 hours or so since that fateful announcement from Buckingham Palace, tributes have been pouring in from across the globe. The mood has overwhelmingly been one of reverence and mourning, but that does not fully reflect the feelings and opinion of millions of others, many of them from countries that were colonized by the United Kingdom and its royal family. Africa had a complicated relationship with the Queen. Some people would even argue that it was somewhat schizophrenic. From brutal repression in Kenya to open support for the end of apartheid, across the continent, Elizabeth II leaves a mixed legacy and mixed feelings behind her. France 24's Nadine Theron starts us off with reaction from the streets of Cape Town.
See where they are living and the type of houses and the poverty they are experiencing. And she wants to walk with that diamond on a crown. The king now needs to give that back to South Africa. While Germany, dealing with Namibia, has done apologies, there's been nothing coming from the British. You colonized our country during colonialism. You expect us to mourn you. No, I cannot mourn the death of Queen Elizabeth.
There's a lot of things that happened in the past that one cannot, I still struggle, how do we move past that? Or maybe the question is, when do we actually have time to address the things that happened back then? So for me, it is a mixed emotion.
I just feel like empty today. It's really sad how it's affected me.
I honestly could care less that she's dead, you know what I mean? It's sad that she's an older person that she's died, but I honestly don't care. I honestly don't care. Because I just feel like a lot of Africans in general were dead because of her, you know what I mean? So I honestly, I'm not bothered.
Well, as we saw just there, mixed emotions across Africa, in South Africa today. For more on that mixed legacy, I'm joined now by Nick Westcott. He's the director of the Royal African Society at SOAS in London. And Nick, I want to begin by reading part of a statement from the Economic Freedom Fighters. It's the third largest party in South Africa's parliament. One might argue it's a bit of a fringe party, but nonetheless, still the third largest party in parliament there. It says, we do not mourn the death of Elizabeth, because to us, her death is a reminder of a very tragic period in this country and Africa's history. This may seem shocking to some viewers. Tell us why there are people who feel this strongly about the Queen and the royal family.
There are definitely two channels of opinion that I've come across in the last day or so from Africa. One is of great nostalgia and affection for the Queen. The other is a residual bitterness at the legacy of colonialism and imperialism, which still bites quite deep, as you heard from some of your interlocutors in South Africa. And both, there is a schizophrenia here. But the Queen's role in it, I think, needs to be understood, because she, of all the people in the British establishment, understood what the independence movement meant. And she worked tirelessly to sustain good human relations between the former colonies and herself. And it was very much at a personal level. She knew many of the independence leaders. She knew many of the African presidents since, and she respected them. And she demonstrated that, for example, in the 1950s, when it was still quite shocking, by dancing arm in arm with Kwame Nkrumah, the new president of independent Ghana. And that she did to send a signal that we now respect these people, treat them as equals. And it was an important message for her own country to understand, as well as the new one. It doesn't remove the sins of colonialism. And those remain. In fact, in some cases, the bitterness about the colonial past has increased as we have got further from it. And the arguments over restitution and reparations for all the harm that was done, the distortions of the economies, the irrational borders, that remains a big issue and has been linked as well to the fight against racism in Western countries themselves or across the whole world. So it's understandable that there are those two reactions, both that people loved her as a person and understood and respected the way she saw the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, in some ways, embodies her own approach to that question of equality. At the same time, it's very hard for the monarchy to divorce itself from the acts of the British government over the centuries, which have indeed caused harm and deserve at least repentance.
Well, I mean, what do you say to people who believe that the Commonwealth was not a way to move away from the British Empire, but really was a way for Britain to keep a tutelage over its former colonies, a way, quite a condescending way, some critics would say, for Britain to teach these countries how to be, self-governing entities?
It was a method of transition. If you look at the period, the 1950s, the 1960s, as independence rolled out across the world, there were many people in the British public who were very reluctant. They were imperialists. They thought the British Empire was a good thing. They wanted it to stay. But the governments of the time, particularly under Macmillan, recognized this was crazy. You would have to spend your life, fighting for people who didn't want to be ruled by you. Therefore, the better choice was to create independence. That required a transition. And the Commonwealth was, in some ways, a transitional way, both for the British to say, we still have an association, but also for the newly independent countries, it gave them an international club to which they could belong, in which their voice was heard and respected. Obviously, the UN existed as well, but it gave them some reciprocal influence on countries like Britain, like Canada, like Australia. And that has proven to be valuable, which is why the independent countries didn't just abandon the Commonwealth, which they would have done if it was a merely neo-colonial structure. And Nkrumah was not interested in being any part of a neo-colonial structure. Likewise, Kenyatta and Nyerere, they stayed because there was value for the newly independent countries in being part of this global association with countries like India, as much as with Britain. So I don't buy the argument that it was just a neo-colonial construct to try and preserve Britain's influence. It did. There were deep links, there were educational links, personal links, and those links still exist. Not because the British are still in Africa, but because the Africans are in Britain.
Let's talk quickly about the Queen's relationship with South Africa. Her personal opinion about apartheid. She's reported to have found shocking Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's quote lack of compassion for the people of South Africa in the 1980s. She traveled to the country just a year after the end of apartheid. She developed a very personal relationship with Nelson Mandela. That's also part of her legacy.
I entirely agree. It's if you like, symbolic that also she gave her first public speech from South Africa by radio, pledging her duty and her service to the people of her country and the Commonwealth. And it embodied what I was trying to explain, that the Queen saw the transition to independence of one of respecting these independent countries as equal partners, not as subordinate ones. And therefore, for her, what was happening in South Africa was abhorrent, and she sided with the independent countries of Africa who wanted South Africa in the Commonwealth, but as a majority rule country. And as you say, there was friction between her and the then Prime Minister Thatcher over that issue. And that's because she really felt strongly the way she wanted the Commonwealth to be, and South Africa did not fit into that in the way under apartheid rule.
All right, Nick Westcott, Director of the Royal African Society at SOAS in London. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Well, as we've just discussed with our guest, the reaction has been mixed across the continent in the past 24 hours. In Nigeria, some recalled Britain's support in the 1960s for a military dictatorship that crushed the Biafra rebellion in the country's east. But President Muhammadu Buhari chose to pay tribute to, quote, a towering global personality and an outstanding leader. Here's Sam Olukoya with more.
In his tribute, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari rightly noted that the story of modern Nigeria will never be complete without a chapter on the Queen. With Nigeria's ties to Britain as a former colony, the Queen was an important personality in Nigeria's colonial and post-independence history. She was even Nigeria's head of state for 3 years after independence. Some Nigerians praise the Queen for sustaining a warm friendship between the United Kingdom and Nigeria, both at the bilateral level and as members of the Commonwealth. The Queen visited Nigeria twice, first in 1956 and then in 2003. The visits, especially the first one, which lasted 20 days, left a lot of enduring memories for her and for Nigerians. The places she visited gained some historical importance and a lot of prestige on account of her visit. President Buhari described her as the only British sovereign known to 90% of Nigerians. But there are those who see the Queen from a different light, especially the younger generations of Nigerians. Some of them see her as representing the negative aspects of Nigeria's colonial past. They said the British colonial government exploited Nigeria's resources and gave back little in return. A Nigerian professor in the United States refused to mourn the death of the Queen, saying British soldiers under the colonial government killed hundreds of women for protesting heavy taxes in 1929. Omowole Sowore, a presidential candidate in next year's general elections, also believed Nigerians should not mourn her death. He said rather, the Queen's death should mark the end of the Commonwealth. Whatever the case, the Queen has left behind a legacy that will remain in the minds of many Nigerians.
Now to Kenya. President Uhuru Kenyatta also paid tribute to the Queen, calling her, quote, a towering icon of selfless service. But Kenya suffered at the hands of colonial Britain. In the 1950s, between 1952 and 1960, an estimated 1 million people in Kenya were taken to concentration camps by British colonial forces. Many of them were tortured and left to die. France 24's Vivian Wandera reports on how Kenyans have reacted to the death of Elizabeth II.
Seems like people have moved on past very fast from the news of the death of the Queen, mostly because of the colonial history that Kenya has with the United Kingdom. Remember, Kenya was once Britain's colony and only gained independence in 1963. And there are still a lot of wounds and a lot of things that have not been dealt with and spoken about. And these things have come up ever since yesterday when the death of the Queen was announced, with many Kenyans saying, yes, we condone with the people of the United Kingdom, but we also need the British government to acknowledge the mistreatment they put our people through, our ancestors and our grandparents through. And some of these people are still alive to date, and they're saying that they need the British government to acknowledge what they did to them, because some of the land injustices that were committed during the colonial times are still being suffered up until now, as people were moved to their homes into other places and are now landless and have nowhere to go, which has become a big issue in Kenya.
Vivian Wandera reporting there from Nairobi. That brings us to the end of this edition of Eye on Africa. We thank you for watching. We leave you with these pictures of the Queen's numerous trips to the continent. Over the course of her 70 years on the throne, she traveled to more than 20 African nations. She once jokingly told Nelson Mandela that she had been to more of Africa than almost anybody. But as we've seen, the legacy she leaves behind in Africa is a complicated and ambiguous one. Our coverage of the death of Queen Elizabeth II continues in just a moment. Stay with us.